The moon was supposed to be quiet. That was the whole point of putting it on the chart the way we did. A soft grey circle with a hard red border, the kind of marking that told every captain in the Talwayan fleet the same thing without a single word attached to it. Stay away. Nothing here but the dead. I had read the file on Kesh Amma 9-11 times before we dropped out of the long jump, and every time it told me the same story. 41 years ago, a mining colony on the surface lost its main reactor to a containment failure. Radiation swept the settlement in under 6 hours. No survivors. No rescue attempted, because by the time the automated distress beacon reached the nearest relay, there was nothing left to rescue. The company that owned the mining rights folded within the season. The system was marked for salvage only, and even the salvage crews were told to stay in orbit and send down drones. I was not supposed to think about any of that. I was a junior surveyor, 3 years out of my training rings, and my only job was to confirm that the mineral seams in the northern ridge were still worth the trip before the main extraction fleet committed real resources. It was supposed to be simple. Scan the surface. Log the readings. Go home to somewhere with a thicker atmosphere and better food. That was the plan right up until the moment my sensor board lit up in a color it was not supposed to show. "Commander," I said, and my voice came out thinner than I wanted it to. "I have a heat signature on the surface." Commander Ocelin turned from the main viewport without hurrying. She was old for a field officer, old enough that her crest had gone the pale silver color that meant she had earned the right to stop being impressed by things. She looked at my display for a long moment before she spoke. "Confirm it isn't residual decay heat from the reactor site," she said. "Old failures sometimes cook for decades." I ran the confirmation twice, because I did not trust myself the first time. The heat was not coming from the reactor site at all. It was coming from 3 kilometers away, in a valley the old survey maps marked as empty rock, and it was moving. "It's not decay," I said. "It's structured. There's a thermal pattern consistent with active habitation. Multiple sources. And Commander, there's light." The bridge went quiet in the particular way that only happens when everyone realizes at the same moment that the file they were given is wrong. "Show me," Ocelin said. I put it on the main screen. A cluster of warm points beneath the ice, arranged in a grid too regular to be geological. Threaded between them, thin lines of even warmer material, the unmistakable signature of powered cable. Somewhere under 41 years of frozen dust, on a moon we had told the entire fleet was a grave, something was very much alive. "That's not possible," said Joran, our systems officer, from the console beside mine. "The colony died in the meltdown. Every record says so." "Every record says so," Ocelin repeated, and there was something careful in the way she said it, the tone of someone choosing not to finish a thought out loud. "Vantik. Prepare a close survey pass. Low altitude, passive sensors only. I want to know what is down there before anyone up here decides what to do about it." I said yes, because that was my job, and because some small stubborn part of me wanted to know the answer more than I wanted to go home to somewhere warm. We spent the next several hours running the shuttle in slow, careful arcs above the valley, close enough to refine the readings without dropping low enough to be noticed from the ground, or so I hoped. Every pass told the same story in finer detail. 61 distinct heat sources. A cable network running under the ice in patterns that matched no natural formation. And, strangest of all, small regular pulses of motion along paths that repeated at consistent intervals, the unmistakable rhythm of people walking the same routes at the same times, day after day, for longer than any of us wanted to guess. "Commander," Joran said quietly, near the end of the 4th pass, "I don't think this is a handful of survivors clinging to a ruin. I think this is a functioning settlement." Ocelin did not answer right away. She stood with her hands folded behind her, watching the slow drift of warm points beneath cold rock, and I understood, even then, that she was doing the same thing I was. Trying to imagine what kind of people build a home in a place the rest of the galaxy has already agreed to forget, and keep it running for 41 years without a single one of us noticing. Log everything, she said finally. And Vantik. Say nothing of this outside this crew until I've decided how to report it. I would like to understand what we've found before someone above us decides it isn't worth understanding at all. I did not sleep well that night, if the shuttle's dim cycle of artificial dusk could be called night at all. I lay in my berth turning the numbers over, the way I had been trained to. In Talwayan service, every ship, every survey team, every fleet down to the smallest maintenance crew, answers to exactly one officer at a time, and that officer answers to exactly one officer above them, all the way up through the ranks to the High Assembly itself. It is not simply how we organize ourselves. It is how we are taught, from our first season of training rings, that order exists at all. A crew with 2 captains is a crew waiting to fail. A decision made by committee is a decision made by no one. I had absorbed that lesson so completely that I had never once thought to question it, any more than I would question the fact that cold makes ice. So when I tried to imagine what kind of structure could keep 61 heat sources moving in patterned, purposeful rhythms beneath the ice of a moon with no listed commander, no registered authority, and no rescue anyone had ever sent, my mind kept returning to the same uneasy possibility. Perhaps there was a commander down there after all, one clever enough, or careful enough, to keep themselves invisible even to passive scans. Perhaps what we had found was not a colony at all, but the beginning of something built by a single mind patient enough to hide behind an entire population for 41 years. It was a frightening thought, and it was also, I would later understand, entirely the wrong question to be asking. There was a smaller fear beneath the larger one, the kind I did not admit to anyone, not even in the log entries I was required to keep. If I reported this wrong, if I underestimated what we had found, or overstated it, the failure would follow me. Junior surveyors did not get a great many chances to prove their judgment sound, and I very badly wanted this to be the discovery that proved mine. I did not know yet that the answer would follow me for the rest of my career, though not for the reasons I feared that first night. I only knew that the moon, which was supposed to hold nothing but silence, was, impossibly, still keeping something alive beneath the ice, and that whatever it was, it had been hiding from us on purpose for 41 years. The valley was called Cinderow, according to the one weathered sign we found still bolted to a rock face near the old surface entrance, half buried in drift snow. The letters had been painted by hand. That detail bothered me more than the heat signatures had. Machines do not paint signs by hand. People do, when they want something to feel like home instead of a work site. We took the shuttle down at first light, though light meant very little on a moon with no real atmosphere to scatter it. Ocelin led 6 of us on the ground team, myself included, mostly because I was the one who had found the anomaly, and she wanted me close enough to explain it if it turned out to be my instruments lying to me. We walked the last stretch on foot, boots crunching over decades of undisturbed frost, our suit lamps throwing long thin shadows across a landscape that every chart I had ever seen insisted was empty. The valley itself gave nothing away from a distance. Grey rock, older ice, the kind of dead stillness that had convinced generations of Talwayan cartographers to stop looking twice at this system at all. It was only as we came around the final ridge that the details began to surface, small and easy to miss if you were not already looking for them. A cairn of stacked stones, too deliberate to be natural, marking a turn in the path. A shallow groove worn into solid rock, the kind that only appears after decades of the same boots crossing the same ground. Once I noticed the first sign of deliberate human hands, I could not stop finding more, and each one landed with the strange, unsettling weight of a word in a language I was only beginning to learn to read. It was not empty, and it was not my instruments. The entrance to the colony was a reinforced hatch set into the base of the ridge, scarred with impact marks and half drifted over, but unmistakably maintained. Someone had scraped the ice from its hinges recently enough that the metal underneath still gleamed. A single lamp burned above it, amber and steady, the kind of light that exists purely to tell a traveler that someone inside is expecting company, even if they were not expecting us specifically. There is no reactor signature strong enough to explain surface habitation, Joran said quietly over the comm, reading numbers from a handheld unit. Whatever is powering this, it is small. Distributed. I am reading dozens of independent sources instead of one central grid. It is almost as if they built it that way on purpose. Ocelin raised a hand, and the team went still. The hatch was opening. The human who stepped out first was smaller than I expected, though every briefing I had ever read about the species should have prepared me for that. She wore layered fabric the color of rust and ash, patched in places with what looked like salvaged hull plating stitched flat with heavy thread. Her hair was pulled back tight against the cold, streaked with grey though her face did not look old. She carried no visible weapon, which surprised me more than anything else about her, standing as she was in front of 6 armed strangers, who had just walked up to her front door out of a supposedly empty sky. "You're a little early," she said, in a voice that carried easily across the frozen ground. "We weren't expecting the flag on this moon to get pulled for another decade at least." Ocelin's translator caught up half a second behind the words, and I watched my commander process the sentence twice before she answered. "You knew we would come eventually," Ocelin said. "We knew someone would," the woman said. "Foreman Adiz Reyes. I run maintenance and logistics for what's left of Cinder Row, such as it is." She looked past Ocelin to the rest of us, unhurried, cataloguing each of us the way I imagined she catalogued every piece of salvage that came through that hatch. "You're the first outsiders to stand on this ice in 41 years. You'll forgive us if we don't throw a parade. We're a little out of practice with company." 41 years. The exact number from our own dead file, spoken back to us like a shared joke neither of us found funny. "Your colony was reported destroyed," I said, before I could stop myself. "A reactor failure. Total loss of life." Reyes's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. "That's the report we filed," she said. "We're still here. We'd appreciate it if that stayed between us for a little longer, but I imagine that ship has already sailed, given you're standing in front of my front door with sensors sharp enough to count my heartbeats from orbit." "You are not afraid of us," Ocelin said. It was not quite a question. "I didn't say that," Reyes replied, and for just a moment something harder moved behind her eyes before it was gone again. "I said we've had 41 years to think about what we'd do if this day ever came. Fear and preparation aren't the same thing, Commander. Come inside. It's cold enough out here to crack a hull seam, and I'd rather have this conversation somewhere I can offer you something warm to drink, even if your biology can't process it." Behind her, deeper in the tunnel, I caught a glimpse of warm light on stone, and the sound, faint but unmistakable, of voices. Not the panicked scattering of survivors caught hiding. Something calmer. Something that sounded, against every expectation I had carried down from orbit, like a place where people lived, and argued, and laughed, and had done all three every single day for 41 years while the rest of the galaxy filed them undergrave. I remember thinking, as I followed her through that hand-scraped hatch into the mountain, that I had come down expecting to survey a grave, and instead I was walking into someone's home. The tunnels beneath Cinder Row opened into a space larger than anything our sensors had suggested from orbit, a cavern reinforced with old mining supports, and newer construction stitched in wherever the rock had needed help. Strings of amber light ran along the ceiling in loose, unofficial rows, clearly added over years rather than built all at once, so that the whole cavern had the patchwork, lived-in look of a place that had grown the way a garden grows, one addition at a time, rather than the way a facility is built, all at once from a single plan. Voices carried from side passages, along with the smell of something cooking that Joran's translator unhelpfully labeled only as organic matter, heated. Reyes led us through what had once been an equipment bay, and was now something closer to a town square. Perhaps 40 humans moved through it, some pausing to look at us with open curiosity, none of them with anything I recognized as fear. A child no taller than my knee peered out from behind a stack of crates before a woman gently steered her back toward a side passage. An old man sat mending a boot near a heat vent, glancing up at us only long enough to nod once, as though visitors from beyond the sky were an interesting, but ultimately unremarkable addition to his afternoon. "How many of you are there?" Ocelin asked. 206, last count, Reyes said. Started with just over 400 when the company pulled out. We lost some in the years right after, before we had the systems dialed in. Haven't lost anyone to the cold or the dark in over a decade now. She said it plainly, the way someone reports a maintenance statistic, but I noticed the 206 settle into my memory like a stone dropped into still water. "The reactor failure," I said. "It never happened." "It happened," Reyes said. "We just made sure it happened in a controlled way, on our terms, after the company already decided we were worth less than the insurance payout for losing us." She gestured for us to sit at a long table scarred with use, its surface worn smooth in places where hands and elbows had rested 1,000 times over. They were going to shut the colony down anyway. Strip the equipment, leave the people to find their own way off a moon with no scheduled transport for 18 months. We did the math. A staged catastrophic loss was the only version of that story where anyone came looking for our things instead of us. "That is an extraordinary risk," Ocelin said. "It was," Reyes agreed. "We took a vote." I found myself staring at her. "A vote? All of you? All of us who were old enough to understand what we were agreeing to," she said. "That's how we do things here. Always has been. Big decisions get put to everyone, not just whoever happens to be standing at the front of the room that day." It was Joran who finally asked the question sitting under all of ours. "Who is in command of this colony, Foreman Reyes? We would like to speak with them directly, so that our reports can be accurate." Reyes looked at him for a moment, and something in her expression shifted, not quite amusement, something closer to genuine puzzlement, as if he had asked her which direction was north while standing in an open field. "You're speaking with someone right now," she said. "I run logistics this quarter. Ask me again next season and you might be talking to Priya, or to old Dem over there with the boot, or to whoever's turn it is." "Whoever's turn," Ocelin repeated carefully. "We rotate," Reyes said, as though this were the most ordinary thing in the world. "Nobody runs Cinder Row. Not permanently. It isn't safe, on a rock this small, to build the whole colony around one person's judgment. What happens if that person gets sick? What happens if that person gets it wrong, or gets greedy, or just gets tired? We learned that lesson early, and we learned it hard, back before we had this figured out." "Hard how?" I asked, before I could stop myself. Reyes was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again some of the easy warmth had gone out of her voice. "The first winter after the company left, we had a man in charge. Made sense at the time, he'd been the site supervisor, people were used to taking orders from him. He made some calls that first season that weren't wrong, exactly. Just his. Weighted toward what he understood, blind to what he didn't. We lost 11 people to a supply miscalculation that a dozen other folks in this colony could have caught, if anyone had thought to ask them." She met my eyes. "After that, we decided no single person gets to be the only one holding the whole picture. Ever again." I glanced at Ocelin and saw, for the first time since we had dropped out of the long jump, a flicker of something like uncertainty cross her face. On our ships, on every world in Talwyan space I had ever known, authority ran in a single unbroken line from a named commander down through the ranks beneath them. It was how order was kept. It was, I had always believed, simply how civilization functioned. Later that evening, while the others toured the hydroponics vaults, I found myself sitting near a young human named Thomas, who could not have been more than a season or two into adulthood by his own species' reckoning. He was teaching himself the mechanics of our shuttle's docking clamp from a printed diagram someone had let him copy, entirely uninvited, entirely unbothered by my presence beside him. "You're not worried," I said, "that I'll report all of this back to my fleet?" He looked up at me and shrugged, unhurried. "Foreman Reyes already will. We don't really keep secrets from each other here. It's not efficient." He tapped the diagram. "If your radios ever go down and you need to signal someone in a hurry, this is the hand sign for emergency assist." He showed me, slow and deliberate, a closed fist raised twice. "Everybody here knows it. Even the kids. Figured you might want to, too, since you're going to be around a while." I did not think much of it at the time. It seemed like a small kindness, the sort of thing offered to a guest without any particular weight behind it. I had no idea, sitting in that warm cavern with the ice 100 meters overhead, how soon I would need it. Before we left that first evening, Reyes walked us past a wide chamber near the cavern's center that she called, without any particular ceremony, the schoolroom, though it bore little resemblance to any teaching hall I had ever seen. Children of clearly different ages sat scattered across the room in loose clusters. Some bent over reading tablets scavenged and repaired so many times they had become a patchwork of mismatched parts. Others gathered around a low table where an adult I did not recognize was walking them through the internal schematic of a water reclamation pump, using the actual disassembled pump as a teaching aid. "You teach them the machinery," I said, surprised. "Alongside their letters." "Alongside everything," Reyes said. "A child here learns to read, learns their numbers, and learns how the reactor cycles, and where the pressure seals are likely to fail, more or less at the same pace. We can't afford to raise anyone who only knows how to follow instructions. Every one of them needs to be able to take over something important, someday, whether or not they ever expect to." She watched the children for a moment, something unguarded crossing her face. "It isn't cruelty, if that's what you're thinking. Give a child a real skill early, and you'd be amazed how much confidence follows it. These are some of the steadiest young people you'll ever meet, off-worlder. They've never once been taught that someone else is supposed to have all the answers." I thought of my own training rings, the long seasons spent learning to defer, to wait for orders, to trust that somewhere above me a mind more qualified than mine had already made the decisions that mattered. I did not yet know what to make of the alternative standing in front of me, only that it unsettled something I had never before thought to question. 3 days into the survey, the shuttle's secondary life support unit failed. It was not a dramatic failure, not at first, only a slow creeping drop in the oxygen scrubber's efficiency that urine caught during a routine check. But a slow failure on a moon this cold was still a failure that would eventually kill everyone aboard, and the replacement part we needed was buried somewhere in a supply manifest 6 months out on the nearest Talwayan logistics schedule. I remember the particular quiet that settled over the shuttle when urine read out the numbers, the kind of quiet that comes when a small mechanical problem quietly becomes a countdown. Reyes heard about it within the hour, because as far as I could tell, nothing happened in Cinder Row that everyone did not hear about within the hour. "Bring it down here," she said. "We'll take a look." Ocelin hesitated, and I understood why. There is a particular discomfort in bringing your own critical failure to a species you were sent to observe rather than depend on. But the alternative was a 6-month wait in a shuttle slowly losing its ability to keep us alive, so we brought the failed unit down into the mountain, carried between 2 of us on a makeshift sled across the ice. What followed was the single strangest hour of my professional life. Reyes did not summon an engineer. She simply raised her voice across the equipment bay and said, "Scrubber trouble, anyone free?" And within minutes a loose cluster of humans had gathered around the unit, none of them apparently in charge, all of them apparently capable. An older man, who had been mending a boot, when we arrived turned out to know the exact tolerance specifications of atmospheric filtration systems from 3 separate manufacturers, none of which matched our own. And yet he read the housing like a familiar text. A woman who had been minding 2 small children handed them off to someone else without a word, and had the unit's casing open within 90 seconds, her hands moving with the certainty of long practice. Thomas, the young man from the docking clamp diagram, produced a scavenged part from a shelf of what looked like carefully sorted salvage, and fitted it into the failing mechanism, with the unhurried confidence of someone who had done this exact repair 100 times before, which, I later learned, he very nearly had. 9 minutes after Reyes called out into the room, the unit was humming at full efficiency again, patched together with a Talwyan-manufactured housing and a human-fabricated filter core that should not, by any specification I knew, have been compatible. How, Joran said, staring at the reassembled unit, did all of you know exactly what to do, without anyone directing the effort? We fixed worse with less, said the woman who had handed off her children, not unkindly, wiping grease from her fingers onto a rag tucked into her belt. You learn to just start, and trust the person next to you knows their part. Waiting around for someone to tell you what to do gets people killed, down here. I watched Ocelin's face very closely in that moment, because I had begun to understand something I did not yet have words for. Every structure I had been raised inside, every ship I had ever served on, was built around the assumption that competence flowed downward from a single point of authority, and that removing that point of authority would cause everything beneath it to fail. What I had just watched was a system with no such point at all, and it had solved a life-threatening technical failure faster than our own dedicated engineering staff would have managed it, working from a supply closet of scavenged parts instead of a fully stocked bay. That night, back aboard our own ship in orbit, Ocelin called me to her quarters. You've been documenting all of this, she said. It was not a question. Extensively, I admitted. Good. She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the pale curve of the moon below us, its surface unremarkable and dark except for the one small valley we now knew was very much alive. Vantik, I want you to understand something before this goes any further. When I report this discovery, it will not stay a small matter. A colony evading its own listed destruction, hidden for 41 years, is the kind of finding that goes up the chain very quickly, and very far above either of us. She turned to face me. I do not yet know if that is good news for the people down there, or very bad news. I would like you to keep watching closely enough that we find out before someone above us decides it without us. I said I would. I did not fully understand, that night, exactly how little time we had left to find out, or how much would come to depend on a small closed fist raised twice. Before I left her quarters that night, Ocelin asked me one more question, quieter than the rest, the kind of question an officer only asks when she has already stopped expecting a comfortable answer. If you had to write the recommendation yourself, Vantik, knowing what you know now, what would you tell the fleet to do about that valley? I did not have a good answer ready, and I told her so. I would tell them it isn't dangerous the way the file feared it might be, I said slowly, working the thought out as I spoke it. But I do not think I could honestly tell them it is harmless, either. It is simply built on a principle none of our doctrine accounts for, and I think that alone is going to frighten people far more than any weapon would have. Ocelin was quiet for a long moment. A weapon, we know how to be afraid of, she said finally. We have protocols for weapons. We have protocols for armies, for hidden fleets, for a single clever enemy hiding among the ranks of a civilian population. What I am not certain we have a protocol for, Vantik, is an entire people who simply decided, a long time ago, that no one among them would ever again be permitted to matter enough to be worth attacking alone. She turned back to the viewport, and did not say anything further, and I let myself out into the corridor, with that thought sitting heavy and unresolved in my chest for the rest of the night. The days that followed settled into something almost like a rhythm. Each morning we took the shuttle down to Cinder Row, And each day I found some new small thing that quietly rearranged what I thought I understood about the species we had been sent to survey. I watched their schoolroom, if it could be called that. A wide chamber where children of different ages worked at different tasks under the loose supervision of whichever adult had rotation that day, learning not only reading and mathematics, but the specific, practical knowledge of the colony itself, how the recycling loops worked, how the reactor cores were maintained, how to read a pressure gauge and know when to worry. I asked Reyes why, and she said simply that a colony this small could not afford to raise children who only knew how to follow. It needed every one of them capable of leading, eventually, whether or not they ever wanted to. I began to understand that this was not sentiment. It was architecture. Every system in Cinder Row, from the water reclamation to the emergency drills Thomas had told me about that first night, was built with the same underlying principle: nothing could depend entirely on one person, one part, one plan. Redundancy was not a safety feature bolted onto the colony. It was the colony. I saw it most clearly in the smallest details. The power grid Joran had puzzled over from orbit, the one built from dozens of independent sources rather than a single central reactor, turned out to be a deliberate choice made in the colony's earliest years, after a single generator failure had nearly cost them an entire winter. Rather than build a larger, sturdier central plant, as any Talwaian engineer would have recommended, they had scattered smaller units throughout the settlement, so that the loss of any one of them, or several, would never threaten the whole. It was, by our own engineering standards, a deeply inefficient way to generate power. It was also, I slowly came to understand, nearly impossible to break in a single stroke. I mentioned this to Joran one evening, back aboard the shuttle, and he sat with it for a long while before answering. "We build our own ships the opposite way," he said finally. "One reactor, heavily shielded, heavily defended, because a single strong point is easier to protect than many weak ones spread thin. It has always seemed the more sensible approach." He looked toward the viewport, toward the small dark valley below us. "I am no longer certain sensible is the same thing as resilient, Vantik. I am not certain it ever was." It was a strange thing, watching my crewmates reckon, each in their own way, with a system built on assumptions so different from our own, that it did not so much argue against Talwaian doctrine, as simply ignore it entirely, the way a river ignores the objections of the rock it has spent 1,000 years wearing smooth. It was on the 7th day that the reply came, and it came from somewhere well above Osselin's authority to argue with. I was in the shuttle bay when Joran found me, his crest flattened in a way I had rarely seen outside of genuine alarm. "Vantik, you need to hear this." The transmission was brief, formal, and utterly without room for negotiation. A Talwaian enforcement fleet under Overcaptain Surik had been dispatched to Kesh Amma 9 on the basis of Osselin's preliminary report. The report, filtered and summarized several times before it reached anyone with real authority, had arrived at command not as the discovery of a resourceful survivor colony, but as something far more alarming: an undeclared population operating hidden, self-sufficient infrastructure inside a restricted zone, concealed for 4 decades, with unknown capability and unknown intent. Somewhere in the retelling, we faked our own destruction to avoid being stripped for parts, had become an unregistered settlement of unknown purpose, possibly hostile, operating beneath the notice of Commonwealth oversight for 41 years. "They think it's a weapons cache," Joran said, low and urgent. "Or worse, a foothold for something they don't have a name for yet. Surik's authorization includes atmospheric sterilization of the valley if the settlement does not immediately surrender full access and identify its command structure for negotiation." "Its command structure," I repeated, and felt something cold settle in my chest that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. Osselin arrived a moment later, and I watched her read the transmission twice, the same way I had read the original Dead Moon file. "Surik has already begun his approach," she said. "He will be in orbit within 6 hours. He is required, under standard protocol, to identify and negotiate with the settlement's ranking authority before authorizing any strike. If no such authority can be identified within the negotiation window, the strike proceeds as a precaution. There is no ranking authority, I said. That is the entire point of what we found down there. There is no single person to negotiate with, no one to surrender, no commander to threaten into compliance. Serik's protocol was not written for a colony like this one. No, Ocelin agreed grimly. It was not. And I suspect that is exactly the shape of the misunderstanding that will get everyone in that valley killed, if we do not find a way to explain it in time. We went down to the surface immediately, but Serik's fleet moved faster than we had hoped. Somewhere in the 6 hours between his arrival and our warning reaching the colony, a targeted strike against our own shuttle's relay array knocked out the only high-power transmitter capable of reaching the enforcement fleet directly. It was, I understood later, meant as a message rather than an attack. A single precise burst aimed at our antenna array and nothing else. A demonstration of what Serik's ships were capable of, aimed to frighten a hidden leadership into stepping forward before he escalated further. Instead it did something Serik had not accounted for at all. It cut the one channel Ocelin could have used to explain, in her own voice, exactly what kind of civilization he was threatening to erase. We were, in every practical sense, cut off. 6 hours from a sterilization order, with no way to reach the fleet in orbit, standing in a cavern full of people, who had no leader to offer up, and no intention of pretending otherwise. Reyes took the news with the same steady calm she had shown from the moment she opened her front door. Well, she said, when I finished explaining what I understood of Serik's protocol, my voice shaking more than hers ever seemed to. That's a problem. Good thing we've had 41 years of practice solving problems without waiting for someone to tell us how. There was no meeting to plan what happened next, no council called, no single voice raised to give instructions. That was, I would come to understand, exactly the point. Within minutes of the news spreading through Cinder Row, the colony simply began to move, each person sliding into whatever role the moment required without anyone assigning it to them. A woman named Priya, whom I had seen only briefly tending the hydroponics vaults, appeared at the old comm station and began stripping down a backup transmitter that had not been used in a decade, working with the calm precision of someone who had built the thing herself, which, as it turned out, she had. The retired reactor technician Reyes had mentioned on our first day, a stooped man named Dem, who spent most of his time mending boots, moved through the tunnels checking structural supports and shouting distances and pressure figures to anyone within earshot, organizing an evacuation route toward the deep vaults without ever once raising his voice to give an order. Thomas, barely into adulthood, took a position near the old surface hatch with a hand terminal and began quietly logging every person's location as they moved, because someone needed to know where everyone was, and he had simply decided that someone would be him. There is no one giving directions, I said to Reyes, who was helping carry cable toward Priya's makeshift transmitter station, coils of it slung over one shoulder. How does everyone know what to do? Everyone knows what needs doing, she said, not breaking stride. We've drilled emergencies like this since before Thomas was born. Nobody needs a title to know how to help. They just need to trust that the person next to them is doing the same math they are. Ocelin, watching all of this unfold with an expression I had never seen on her before, turned to me. Vantik. Serik's protocol requires him to identify a commander before he authorizes the strike. If there is genuinely no such figure to identify, what does that leave him? I thought of the young man beside me on my first night in the colony, the closed fist raised twice, offered without ceremony to a stranger who might need it someday. It leaves him a colony he cannot decapitate, I said slowly, because there is no head to remove. And a fleet in orbit that believes silence means either compliance, or a threat too dangerous to wait out. Then we have to give him something else to believe, Ocelin said. Before the window closes. I asked Joran, while we worked, what exactly Serik's fleet would be looking for in the meantime, up in orbit, watching a valley gone briefly and unexpectedly silent on every channel they had expected to hear a reply on. He did not look up from the coupling he was fitting into place. "Patterns," he said. "A ship like his will be scanning for the signature of coordinated defense, weapons platforms powering up, a single strong transmission trying to rally a resistance. That is what a hidden threat looks like, to sensors trained to find one." He tightened the last fitting and finally met my eyes. What he will actually see, if his instruments are good enough to read it properly, is 206 separate small movements, none of them large enough alone to look like anything at all. I am not certain his protocols have a name for that shape of activity. I am not certain anyone's do. It was, I would come to understand, the heart of the entire misunderstanding balanced now on the edge of a closing deadline. Serik's fleet had been trained to search for the signature of a threat organized the way every threat his service had ever encountered was organized, around a single directing will. What Cindereau was doing in that hour had no such signature to find, not because it was hidden more cleverly than anything he had faced before, but because it had never been built with a center to hide in the first place. The work that followed had none of the drama I had always imagined would accompany a moment like this. There was no shouting, no panic, only a steady, almost domestic urgency, as though the colony were responding to a burst pipe rather than the possible end of everything it had spent 41 years building. Priya's backup transmitter came online 40 minutes before Serik's deadline, patched together from scavenged Talwayan parts, and 41-year-old human engineering with the same easy, borrowed competence I had watched fix a life support scrubber in 9 minutes. It had barely enough range to reach our own shuttle, let alone Serik's fleet directly, but it was enough to reach Yoran, still stranded in orbit with our damaged relay, and Yoran still had one working channel left to Ocelan's command authority, thin and battered but alive. While Priya worked, I found myself pressed into service in a way I had not expected, holding a length of cable steady while a teenager I had not yet met spliced its ends together with hands that did not shake. Around us, the cavern moved with 100 small, coordinated motions, crates of supplies being ferried toward the deep vaults, children being gathered and counted by Thomas's steady tally, Dem's voice carrying down the tunnels with distances and structural warnings that everyone seemed to hear and act on without needing to be told twice. "You are not afraid," I said to the teenager beside me, mostly to fill the silence, mostly because I badly wanted to hear someone say they were not. She glanced at me, surprised by the question. "Course I'm afraid," she said. "Everyone here is. We just don't let it stop our hands from moving. Fear's fine. Fear's honest. Freezing up is the only thing that actually gets people killed." She tied off the last splice and tested the connection with a small, satisfied nod. "There. That should hold." It was not a grand rescue. It was a chain of small, unglamorous fixes, each one made by whoever happened to be closest to the problem, stitched together by people who had spent 41 years learning to trust each other without needing anyone to tell them how. I stood in the middle of it, a surveyor 3 years out of his training rings, and understood for the first time in my life that I was watching a form of civilization I had never once been taught to recognize as civilization at all. Partway through, a young man came stumbling into the equipment bay carrying a boy no older than 6. The child's arm bent at an angle that made my translator flinch before it even finished rendering the shout for help. There was no pause, no search for whoever was supposed to handle emergencies of this kind. A woman near the transmitter station simply set down the tool she was holding, crossed the room, and had the boy's arm splintered and the child calmed within a few short minutes, murmuring to him the entire time in a low, steady voice that had nothing to do with fear at all. When she finished, she picked the tool back up and returned to what she had been doing before, as though the interruption had cost her nothing but a few minutes she had always known she might need to spare. "She isn't a doctor," I said to Reyes, watching this unfold. "She's had the training," Reyes said. "So has about a third of this room. We rotate that too." You never know which pair of hands is going to be free when someone needs them. She looked at me, and something in her expression softened, just slightly, around the edges of the tension she was otherwise carrying without complaint. That's the whole trick of it, Vantik. Not one hero. Just enough hands trained well enough that it almost never matters whose turn it is. The message that finally reached over Captain Surik, 40 minutes before his strike window closed, did not come from a commander at all, because there was none to send it. It came from Ocelin, relayed through a young engineer's jury-rigged transmitter, carrying words that had been assembled, argued over, and refined by a dozen different voices in the cavern below in the span of half an hour. I stood beside Reyes as Ocelin read it aloud for confirmation before transmission, and I watched the humans around us listen not as an audience waiting on their leader's words, but as a group checking that the message still said what they had all agreed it should say. Someone near the back muttered a correction about a phrase that sounded too much like an apology, and Priya adjusted it without argument, and no one in the room seemed to find that unusual at all. Over Captain Surik, Ocelin transmitted. This settlement has no ranking authority to identify, because it was deliberately built to have none. That is not concealment of intent. That is the intent. I have observed this colony directly for 7 days. Its people fabricated their own recorded destruction 41 years ago to avoid being abandoned by a company that valued their equipment above their lives. And they have survived since through a system of shared, rotating responsibility that has no single point of failure and no single point of command. There is nothing here to negotiate within the way your protocol expects, because there is nothing here built the way your protocol expects. I am transmitting my full survey record. I ask you to review it before you act, because a strike authorized to remove a hidden leadership will not remove anything but 206 people who never had one. The reply took 11 minutes, the longest 11 minutes I have ever experienced, standing in a mountain full of people who had just staked their survival on a message none of them had been able to send alone. When Sarik's response finally came through, his voice carried none of the alarm I had expected, only the flat, careful tone of an officer recalculating a decision in real time. Commander Ocelin, he said. Your survey record is being reviewed. I am holding position pending full analysis. Be advised, this is not a decision I make lightly, given the protocols under which I was dispatched. But I will say this. In 40 years of service, I have never once received a report describing a target that cannot be identified because it was built specifically not to have one. A pause, longer than the translation lag accounted for. I would like to speak with someone from the settlement directly, if that is possible. It is, Ocelin said, and looked to Reyes. Reyes stepped forward without hesitation, the same unhurried calm she had greeted us with on the first day still steady in her voice, though I noticed, standing close beside her, that her hands were pressed flat against her thighs, the only sign she gave that any of this frightened her at all. This is Foreman Reyes, currently on logistics rotation for Cinder Row. I can speak for the colony's decisions this season, though I'll remind you that isn't the same as speaking for it permanently. Ask us what you need to ask, over Captain. We've got nothing left to hide, and frankly, we're a little tired of hiding it. I do not know exactly what was said in the conversation that followed, because much of it happened on a channel I was not cleared to hear. I know only that Sarik's fleet held position through the night, that his strike window closed with no order given, and that by morning, the survey record Ocelin had transmitted had been forwarded, without her authorization, or her objection, to every officer in his command structure and several well above it. The negotiations that followed took the better part of 6 weeks, most of them conducted far above my clearance, and far above Ocelin's, in rooms neither of us ever saw. What filtered down to us came in pieces. A formal inquiry into the mining company's original abandonment of the colony, a quiet, careful reclassification of Kesh Amma 9 from restricted grave site to recognized settlement, and eventually, an agreement that surprised everyone who had expected the humans to ask for rescue. Ocelin spent much of those 6 weeks in closed communication with officers well above her rank, defending a survey record that more than one senior officer apparently found difficult to believe on its face. I was not present for most of those exchanges, but I was present for one, near the end of the third week, when a visiting inspector general asked her directly, with no small amount of skepticism in his voice, how a colony with no commander could possibly be trusted to honor any agreement the Commonwealth negotiated with it. "You are asking who will be held accountable if the agreement is broken," O'Sullivan said. "I understand the concern. But I have spent 7 days inside that settlement, Inspector, and I would ask you to consider a different question. Who holds a Talwayan commander accountable the day that commander makes a catastrophic error, or falls ill, or simply loses the confidence of those beneath them? One officer, replaced by one successor, while everyone below waits to see whether the new hand is steadier than the last. Cinder Row does not have that problem, because it never allowed a single hand to matter that much in the first place. I would not call that a weakness in their character, sir. I would call it a correction of one in ours." I do not know whether the Inspector General was persuaded. I know only that O'Sullivan never once wavered from that position in any conversation I witnessed afterward, and that something in the careful, silver-crested caution I had always known in her had shifted, quietly and permanently, somewhere in that mountain full of people who trusted whoever stood next to them. They did not ask to be relocated. They asked to be left where they were. I stood on the surface of Kesh Amma 9 on the day the agreement was finalized, watching a work crew fit a new lamp above the old hatch, this one drawing power from a proper grid connection instead of a scavenged battery bank. Reyes stood beside me, arms folded against the cold, watching the same small ceremony of wires and light with an expression I had come to recognize as her version of quiet satisfaction. "You could have asked for more," I said. "A habitat with a thicker atmosphere. Proper Talwayan medical support. An easier life than this ice has ever given you." "We could have," she agreed. "Talked about it, actually. Took a vote, same as everything else." She glanced at me sideways. "Wasn't close. This is our home, Vantik. We built it out of nothing but stubbornness and scrap metal, and it's kept 206 people alive for 41 years without anyone's permission. We weren't about to trade that for someone else's idea of comfortable." "And the rotation?" I asked. "It continues." "Course it does," she said, as though I had asked whether the sun would rise. "Dem's up next quarter. Man's going to complain about it the whole time, and do a fine job regardless." She smiled, and for the first time since I had met her, it reached all the way to her eyes. "That's rather the whole idea, isn't it? Nobody has to be brave enough to lead forever. They just have to be willing to take their turn." I thought, standing there, of every briefing I had ever read on Talwayan command structure, every lesson drilled into me since my first year of training rings about the necessity of a clear, unbroken chain of authority. I thought of Overcaptain Serik's protocol, written to find and negotiate with a single commander, utterly unable to comprehend a settlement with none, and how close that single gap in understanding had come to erasing everything standing in front of me. "I have been trying to understand," I told Reyes, "how a system with no one truly in charge can hold together at all. My whole career, I was taught the opposite. That order requires a single point holding everything else in place." "Order does," Reyes said. "Just not the way you're thinking. We've got plenty of order, Vantik. Rules, drills, agreements, all of it. We just didn't build it around any one person being irreplaceable. Turns out that's a lot harder to break." She looked out at the ridge, at the new lamp glowing steady above the hatch, at the thin lines of fresh cable being run out from it toward buildings that had, until 6 weeks ago, existed only in the dark, unknown to the rest of the galaxy. "We didn't build it this way because it was clever. We built it this way because we didn't have any other choice, and it turned out to work better than the thing we lost." I left Kesh Amma 9 3 days later, though I would return more than once in the years that followed, first as a survey escort, later, once my own career had bent around what I had witnessed there, as something closer to a liaison. I carried with me a survey report that would, in time, quietly reshape how our fleet approached every subsequent human colony we encountered, cited in briefings I never expected to see my own name attached to. But it was not the report I thought about most in the long jump back toward home. It was the small things. The closed fist raised twice, offered to me on my first night without ceremony, a kindness meant only to keep a stranger safe if the radios ever failed, that had, in the end, kept a channel of trust open between two species that had very nearly destroyed each other over a misunderstanding neither side intended. The teenager beside me during the worst of it, hand steady on a length of cable, telling me plainly that fear was honest and freezing was the only true danger. The old man mending a boot on the day we arrived, glancing up just long enough to nod, as if visitors from beyond the sky were an interesting, but ultimately unremarkable addition to his afternoon, because his colony had survived worse arrivals than us, and would go on surviving long after we left. I asked Reyes, on that last day, what she thought would happen now that the whole Commonwealth knew Cinder Row existed. She considered the question with the same unhurried care she brought to everything else, watching the lamp above her hatch burn steady against the dark. "Same thing we've always done," she said finally. "Whoever's turn it is next season will figure it out." That's rather the whole idea. We had been taught, all of us in the Talwyan fleet, to look for the head of every structure we met, certain that finding it would tell us everything worth knowing about the whole, certain that removing it would end whatever resistance stood in our way. On a small frozen moon we had once marked as a grave, I learned instead that some of the strongest things in the galaxy are built with no head to find it all, only 206 people, and counting, who had simply decided, over and over again, season after season, to trust whoever stood next to them. The lamp above the hatch was still burning when our shuttle broke orbit. I watched it until the curve of the moon took it from view, small and steady against the endless dark, and I thought, not for the last time, that we had come looking for ruins, and found a home instead. Years later, when my own career had carried me far past that first survey, and into rooms where younger officers came to me the way I had once come to Osselin, I would tell them the same thing every time the subject of Kesh Amma 9 came up, which it did more often than I ever expected. I would tell them that the mistake over Captain Surik so nearly made was not stupidity, and it was not cruelty. It was the ordinary, understandable mistake of a mind trained its whole life to look for a single thread to pull, standing in front of a people who had spent 41 years deliberately weaving themselves into something with no single thread at all. I still keep, tucked somewhere in my personal effects, a printed copy of that old diagram Thomas once let me borrow, the shuttle docking clamp schematic with its careful, handwritten annotations, and beside it, folded small, a sketch he made for me on my last day in the valley, a simple closed fist raised twice, the whole of it labeled in his neat, deliberate script, for when the radios go down, and you need someone, anyone, to know you're still there. I have never needed to use it. I have never once forgotten what it meant that he thought to give it to me anyway, before he knew whether we would ever return.